Only 8 countries have ever won the FIFA World Cup, since the first finals were held in Uruguay in 1930, and those 8 tend to be the favourites going into every World Cup. This World Cup is no exception, where, despite 4-time winners Italy failing to qualify for a second successive World Cup, the other 7 are literally the 6 favourites to win it, plus Uruguay, who are the 11th favourites. And yet, the reigning champions, who you might think would be the most fancied and best equipped team to defend their crown, have an absolutely abysmal record at recent tournaments. Italy, who won the World Cup in 2006, were atrocious in 2010, finishing bottom of a group which was made up of themselves, Paraguay, Slovakia and New Zealand, and they have never really recovered. Dumped out in the group stage once again in Brazil in 2014, and failing to even qualify in 2018 and 2022. This, for a country that has won the World Cup 4 times, had only previously failed to qualify once, in 1958, and hadn't got out in the group stage since 1974, is a pretty extraordinary record. Likewise, Spain, who were by far the best team at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, which they very deservedly won, a success that was sandwiched by consecutive European Championship successes, were abysmal just 4 years later in Brazil in 2014. Despite scoring first, Spain lost their World Cup opener 5-1 against the Netherlands, and a 2-0 defeat to Chile in their second game meant that they were eliminated before they had even played their final group fixture. And to make it 3 from 3, Germany, who beat Brazil 7-1 en route to winning the 2014 World Cup, also went out in the group stage 4 years later, in Russia in 2018, where they finished dead last in Group F, behind Sweden, Mexico, and South Korea. Germany are the most consistent team in the history of the FIFA World Cup. They have reached 8 finals, they've won 4 of them, and 2018 was their first-round exit since 1938, before the World Cup even had a group stage, and when they lost in a round of 16 replay against Switzerland. If the Germans aren't safe as World Cup winners, then no one is, which has led to the theory that perhaps there is a curse on World Cup winners. After all, even before Italy in 2010, France suffered a shock exit in the group stage as reigning champions in 2002, Brazil went out in the group stage in 1966 despite having been champions in both 1958 and 1962, and Italy fell to a similar fate in 1950 following their consecutive successes in 1934 and 1938. So in today's video, as France prepare to kick off their World Cup defence in Qatar, up against Australia, Denmark and Tunisia, I thought that it might be worth taking a look at the so-called World Cup winners' curse, whether it is a curse at all, the reasons behind it, and whether France are likely to be its next victims at this World Cup. Clearly, it's very difficult to win back-to-back World Cups. Only 2 teams have ever done it, and none in the last 60 years, namely Italy in 1934 and 1938, the first of which was extremely contentious, and Brazil in 1958 and 1962, with probably the single most talented group of players that any country has ever had at their disposal. The opposition at a World Cup is so formidable, the pressure is so extreme, and the margin for error is so fine that it's not surprising that no team has successfully defended their World Cup crown since the tournament has been broadcast in colour. But that doesn't explain the shocks, group stage exits, and total capitulations. To identify the patterns behind these failures, it is worth taking a slightly closer look at each of them on their own merit. Starting with France in 2002, which is often cited as being when the so-called curse began. France were the best team in world football at the turn of the millennium, not just the best in the international game, but the strongest club or national team side, and they are arguably the last national team that you could make that claim about. In 1998, France won their first World Cup on home soil, as an enormous wellspring of talent just seemed to emerge at the perfect time. France had one of the youngest squads at the tournament, as youngsters like Patrick Vieira, Thierry Henry and David Trezeguet brought a youthful zeal to their squad. Meanwhile, a back four of Thauvin Blanc, Desailly and Lizarazu is among the most formidable in the entire history of the sport. They had a sprinkling of experience thanks to both Blanc and their captain Didier Deschamps, and an all-time great in the form of Zinedine Zidane acting as their talisman. France not only won the World Cup, they conceded just 2 goals all tournament, cruising to a 3-0 win against Brazil in the final, following Ronaldo's infamous seizure on the morning of the game. 2 years later, in Belgium and the Netherlands, if anything, France had an even stronger team at Euro 2000. The back four was still intact and unchanged, and by this stage, the likes of Vieira, Henry and Trezeguet were bona fide world-class players, and Zizou was at the absolute peak of his powers. It is no surprise then that France became the first country in history to win the World Cup and the Euros back-to-back, and going into the 2002 World Cup, France were the joint favourites along with Argentina to make it 3 from 3 in South Korea and Japan. It seemed to be a reasonable assessment. Not only had France won the last Euros and World Cup, they also won the Confederations Cup in 2001, topping their group before beating Brazil and Japan in the semis and the final, and the core of their squad remained unchanged. Blanc was gone, replaced by Frank Leboeuf, who had started for France in the final in 1998 anyway due to Blanc's suspension. Meanwhile, Vieira, Henry and Trezeguet were playing even better at club level than they had been going into Euro 2000. In their final warm-up game against South Korea though, just 5 days before their opening game, Zinedine Zidane hobbled off at half-time. It was the worst possible start to the World Cup for France, losing their star man, as it was confirmed that Zizou would miss at least the first 2 games. France's opening game, which was the opening game of the 2002 World Cup, was also arguably the worst possible game for them, up against a fast, frantic, and extremely motivated Senegal team, competing in their first ever FIFA World Cup. All but 3 members of Senegal's 23-man squad played their club football in France. France's backline might have been largely unchanged in terms of personnel, but they certainly looked very different in terms of their athleticism. All 4 were over the age of 30, Leboeuf and Desailly at centre-back, aged 33 and 34, and they were run ragged by a 21-year-old El Hadji Diouf and a 23-year-old Nusa Ndai. Henry and Vieira, who brought so much strength, speed and intent to Arsenal, looked dead on their feet in Seoul. Vieira described himself as having been cooked in South Korea, having played virtually every game, along with Henry, in Arsenal's double-winning campaign. France lost the game 1-0, and a red card for Thierry Henry, only 25 minutes into their second group game against Uruguay, meant that they had to settle for a draw. In France's final group game against Denmark, in which anything other than a win would see them eliminated, Zidane returned. But clearly, he wasn't at 100%, or even 75%, and France were well beaten by the Scandinavians. It was a cocktail of an ageing squad, an injury to their star man, and chronic fatigue for some of their next best players, and a moment of madness resulting in a red card that ultimately proved to be lethal for France's World Cup hopes. This was not a bad group of players all of a sudden. Even some of France's old guard still went on to win their group at Euro 2004 and to reach the final of the 2006 World Cup. But a series of unfortunate events saw them finish bottom of what many had described pre-tournament as being an easy group. Brazil won the 2002 World Cup, and they are the last country to have won the World Cup and not gone out in the group stage at the following tournament. The World Cup curse, therefore, could be deemed as being a solely European phenomenon, though that might just be because European teams have won 5 out of the last 6 World Cups. I still think that it is worth taking a little look at Brazil, who went into the 2006 World Cup as the tournament favourites, and though they did manage to navigate a very easy group before beating Ghana in the round of 16, the first time that they came up against formidable opposition, in the form of 2002 flops France, they lost 1-0, in a game that was dominated by Zinedine Zidane. Brazil had a dizzying array of talent going into the 2006 World Cup, with the likes of Cafu, Roberto Carlos, Kaká, Ronaldinho, Ronaldo and Robinho. But as with France in 2002, several of those star players were nearing the end of their careers. Cafu was 36, Carlos was 33, and though Ronaldo was only 29, injuries had taken their toll, and he was on the verge of leaving Real Madrid, a pale shadow of the man who lit up the 1998 and 2002 World Cups. Italy enjoyed a polar opposite experience to Brazil at the 2006 World Cup, which they went into being largely unfancied, written off as a country in crisis following the Calciopoli scandal. What those who wrote Italy off for issues away from the pitch failed to realise was that they had a squad laced with quality. Some dubious officiating had seen them dumped out by the host South Korea in the round of 16 in 2002, but Buffon, Cannavaro, Pirlo and Totti formed an almost peerless spine, and Italy, like France in 1998, conceded just 2 goals all tournament. 4 years later in South Africa though, Cannavaro was still captaining Italy, now aged 36, Pirlo was 31, and Totti had retired. Nonetheless, Italy were gifted not just with the easiest group at that World Cup, but one of the weakest of all time, pitted alongside Paraguay, Slovakia, and New Zealand. Not only did they fail to win a single game, Italy conceded 5 goals in 3 games, having conceded just 2 goals in 7 games in 2006, and they finished bottom of that group. Italy were turgid, lethargic, and offered no real attacking intent in South Africa, in what is probably the worst ever showing by a reigning world champion, and it was described as the nation's biggest sporting disaster at the time. Little did they know that they wouldn't even qualify in 2018 or 2022. Whilst France and Italy's group stage exits were both shocking, the one that took me most by surprise was Spain in 2014. Spain went into that tournament off the back of 3 successive major tournament crowns, an unprecedented era of success for any European national team. And though Barcelona's 2013 and 2014 Champions League exits suggested that perhaps theirs and Spain's era of dominance was coming to an end, that tiki-taka might have been starting to generate diminishing returns, and that the Gegenpressing Germans might just have started to leapfrog them, they were still a team that everyone wanted to avoid. Ramos, Piqué and Alba were all still at the peak of their powers at the back, as was Sergio Busquets just in front of them, though Andres Iniesta was 30 and Xavi was 34. Meanwhile, Fernando Torres had suffered a steep slump in form ever since that move to Chelsea, and there was just a sense that Diego Costa, naturalised as a Spaniard following his years with Atletico Madrid, didn't quite fit their silky possession-based system. And so it proved. Spain's game from 2008 onwards was so dependent upon suffocating the opposition by not relinquishing possession of the ball. But the Netherlands battered them on the counter-attack. They were too quick and too direct for a startled Spanish team, and that set the tone for Chile to take the game to them, once again following that 5-1 defeat. It was a similar story with the Germans. They weren't the favourites going into the 2018 World Cup, but almost everyone expected them to progress from a group made up of Sweden, Mexico, and South Korea. After losing 1-0 to an energetic Mexico team that ran them ragged and held firm in their opening game, even a 95th minute winner against Sweden didn't resurrect Germany's tournament. And a 2-0 defeat, courtesy of 2 more injury-time goals against South Korea, served as the final nail in their coffin. What almost all of these group stage departures have in common, with the possible exception of Germany in 2018, is that the World Cup winners allowed their squads to grow stale in the 4 years between winning the tournament and defending their crown. There seems to be an understandable loyalty that managers have towards the players who won them the World Cup, for obvious reasons, but which results in them being reluctant or simply unable to bring fresh blood and inject some youth and energy into their squads. Apart from anything else, not only is everyone 4 years older, which means that players who were perhaps at their peak when you won the World Cup no longer are. I'm thinking perhaps of Cannavaro in 2006 to 2010, or Jerome Boateng from 2014 to 2018. Inevitably, some key players also retire, at least from international football, between the two tournaments. Germany went from winning the World Cup in 2014 to finishing bottom of their group in 2018, but in the space of those 4 years, they lost their captain Philipp Lahm, who was practically faultless in Brazil, their midfield talisman Bastian Schweinsteiger, who had been integral to them for the past decade, and the World Cup's all-time leading goalscorer in the form of Miroslav Klose. That isn't quite the spine of their 2014 World Cup winning team, because Lahm played at fullback, but it is certainly three of their most important players, both in terms of their talent and performances, but also their leadership and presence within the dressing room. It is a similar story with Spain, who had lost Carlos Puyol by 2014, Italy, who were without Francesco Totti by 2010, and France, who had lost their captain from their 1998 World Cup and Euro 2000 successes, Didier Deschamps, by the time that the 2002 World Cup came around. In the case of France in 2002, I think that it is telling that, at the time, the World Cup winners had no qualification process, since they qualified for the next World Cup automatically. That meant that France had no competitive fixtures, with the exception of the Confederations Cup, which is basically a friendly tournament regardless, between the final of Euro 2000 and their opening game of the 2002 World Cup. It is notable that Roger Lamar, the France boss, had taken those 2 years as an opportunity to experiment with how his team played in a series of uncompetitive matches. And by the time the World Cup came around, and they faced a Senegal team who, in the words of Neil Warnock, would have been willing to die to get 3 points, they looked disjointed, outfought, and outrun. The reigning champions have had to qualify since 2006, but since qualifying can be so easy for European nations, if they aren't matched with at least one really strong side in their qualifying group, it is eminently possible for a rustiness and a complacency to still set in over those 2 years. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why South Americans, albeit it is a much smaller sample size, haven't been affected by the World Cup winners' curse to quite the same extent, since they are constantly going toe-to-toe with the best teams on their continent in meaningful matches. Of course, there is also an element of, in winning the World Cup, you become the team to beat, and there is an enormous amount of pressure on you. A World Cup group stage, we also ought not forget, is just 3 games. It's not like a league season or even a Champions League group stage, increasing the odds of an upset and tightening the margin of error. It takes only 2 off days, a moment of madness, or a couple of silly errors, and anyone can be dumped out of a World Cup, no matter how good you are or what you achieved 4 years ago. If it wasn't for Thierry Henry's red card after 25 minutes in France's second group game against Uruguay in 2002, they would most likely to have gone on to win that game, relieving a lot of the pressure ahead of their final group game against Denmark, and who knows, maybe then they wouldn't have risked Zidane and they might have even progressed. Spain conceded 5 goals in the space of just 20 minutes against the Netherlands, in a freakish period which destroyed their cloak of invincibility and almost all of their confidence with it in 2014. Suddenly, they were beatable, and I have no doubt that changed the way in which Chile approached that second group game against them. The tournament opener is so important for every team, and the World Cup winners are no exception. It is no surprise to me that all 4 of France in 2002, Italy in 2010, Spain in 2014, and Germany in 2018 all suffered shock results, and shock defeats in 3 of those instances, in their opening games. So what does all of this mean for France at this World Cup? In theory, it should mean absolutely nothing. Curses aren't real, in the supernatural sense, correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and their circumstances are different to every defending champion that has been dumped out in the group stage, including themselves in 2002. Nonetheless, it is something that people will talk about, and which will no doubt be playing on some of their minds, and France come into this World Cup in just about the worst form out of anyone other than England and Wales. France have won just one of their last 6 games, and whilst they have what looks to be an easy group to progress from, containing 2 of the tournament's likely whipping boys in Tunisia and Australia, plus more formidable opposition in the form of Denmark, the same could be said for a number of former winners who fell victim to the curse. France also have injuries to a few key players, such as Paul Pogba, N'Golo Kante and Presnel Kimpembe, along with Christopher Nkunku, who was injured in one of France's first training sessions in Qatar and forced to pull out of their squad. Oddly, I think that some of those could be a blessing in disguise for France, forcing them into the regeneration and to entrust youngsters, unlike many stale former winners. And the likes of Aurelien Tchouameni and Eduardo Camavinga are capable of injecting real energy, impetus, and talent into their midfield. I also think William Saliba is a better centre-back than Presnel Kimpembe, though whether the Arsenal man will start for Les Bleus is as yet unclear. France still have the best depth of any national team in the world, but it's less clear as to whether they have the best starting 11 at this World Cup. It is unclear, as I say, who will start at centre-back. Adrien Rabiot will almost certainly start in central midfield, even though I personally think that France have better alternatives in his position than him. And though Kylian Mbappe and Karim Benzema are a phenomenal front two in terms of their talent, they haven't yet managed to hit it off together for France. Lots of French football fans have questioned whether Didier Deschamps is capable of getting the best out of them together, and there is even talk that he might start Olivier Giroud ahead of Benzema, who just won the Ballon d'Or, not Giroud, that is Benzema there, but hasn't been as deadly this season, or at least not in the Champions League, as he was last season. And since recording that part of this video, Benzema has also been injured and ruled out of the tournament, making it, well, not just unlikely, but certain that he won't feature, and adding to France's injury problems. France are always a team that seem capable of imploding, as we saw most emphatically of all in 2010, and this World Cup is no exception. The likes of Guendouzi, Rabiot, and Benzema before that injury ruled him out of the tournament are all no strangers when it comes to controversy and scandals. Meanwhile, some have accused Kylian Mbappe of having been on a bit of a power trip ever since the Qataris offered him the earth to keep him at PSG for another 2 seasons. There is also immense pressure on Didier Deschamps' shoulders following France's poor performance and elimination at the hands of Switzerland at Euro 2020, with Zinedine Zidane waiting in the wings and viewed by many as his successor, following more than a decade in that job. It was France who started the World Cup champions curse, as we know it, at the 2002 World Cup, and 20 years on, they will be hoping that they can be the team that ends it in Qatar. That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know how you think France will perform at this World Cup in the comments, and why not subscribe and turn on notifications for the ever brilliant HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram via the username at HITC Sevens on both. And if you're not quite done listening to me ramble on just yet, I will be leaving a link to my documentary about the 2022 World Cup in Qatar at the end of each of my videos, which means that it should be on your screen now. Click on that if you want to watch it, or, don't if you don't. But either way, have a brilliant day.